Okay, tonight I am. You might notice a little difference. My additional accoutrement to my video recording setup now is a pair of lights. Because when I'd record at night, what would often happen is it would look like I was like a 60 Minutes guy, when they're trying to keep him, confidential. He's got a hat on and he's all shadowed out and he's like speaking with a distorted voice. The company X did dump bunch of poison into the water or whatever, somebody trying to keep their identity confidential. That's not really what I'm trying to do. Not quite the look I'm going for. So I would imagine if you actually are listening to any of this stuff, you're probably doing so in the background and not even paying attention to the video anyway. But for those of you that happen to catch a glance, you get to see more of this in a clearer, brighter light. So consider yourself blessed. Anyway, uh, today I am going to talk a little bit about something that can be potentially contentious. Uh, Now, I have been blessed truly in the last year or so of being a member of a group who kind of the target audience for this. So, those the members of this group, these videos that I'm making, most of them, and they create what is in modern parlance a safe space to talk about, you know, potentially contentious subjects like religion and politics and all those other things. Um, and under the mutual understanding that we're doing so, trying to come to an understanding of one another a little better, how we view the world and all that other stuff, without attacking each other. We're not trying to convert anybody. We're just trying to explain where we see things and try to understand how other people see things and maybe come to some kind of understanding, at least if not an agreement, but kind of getting where the other person is coming from and maybe learning a few things. Okay. It was just something that's kind of lacking in society, I think, especially in this post social media era. Okay. um, uh, I am as guilty of this as anyone else. Okay. When I'm driving a car, uh, I oftentimes kind of dehumanize the people in the other vehicles around me. They are driver and car, and they are either driving responsibly or they're driving in a way I don't like. And I say things that I might not say to them if they were in person and I was actually humanizing them correctly. I've never been super aggressive, but I have personally have been flipped off by people. Happened a couple of months ago to me, and I don't know what I did. I don't know what I did to offend this guy, but he was mad as a hornet, boy. He was shooting me looks. I saw him a couple other times in traffic, and he was shooting me those looks, and I was trying to exchange the look to him. I'm like, I don't know what I did, man. I'm sorry. Whatever it was. This guy though, he was whatever I did set him off. He was not happy, and you know, I was reminded of the road rage incidents that you don't really read about these too often anymore, but people would get so worked up while they're stuck in traffic or whatever that they would, you know, eventually be yelling at each other or whatever through their windshields, and then finally somebody would jump out of their car and blow the other guy away or whatever. Now, I would venture to guess that whatever drove that person to do that, there was a lot more going on under the hood, and it really didn't actually have anything to do with this other person that just ended up on the wrong end of that, level of violence. That there was something else going on in that person's life, and that was just the straw that broke the camel's back, boy. Um, and I would say in a similar way with social media, we kind of distance ourselves using screens that allow us to dehumanize the other person. We can say things that we wouldn't otherwise say to somebody that we actually were looking at eye to eye, face to face, because when we are in true social company, we tend to be a little more empathic, and we read facial cues and all those other things that make us identify a little bit more with them and makes us a little more civil. And our political discourse right now, especially on social media, is not civil, boy. And what I see a lot of, especially in the last 10 years, and I kind of peg this around the time of the 2016 election, where the language has gotten so hostile that if you even espouse a particular opinion that doesn't fit in with a particular paradigm, you are now labeled with a certain name, a commie, a fascist, or whatever. Now, I imagine that most of the time when somebody says that to somebody else, if I call you a fascist, most of those folks, I don't think they really even understand what that word actually means, right? I know what they mean. They're not talking about the fascia, the Roman symbol of unity, or the hatchet with, a bunch of rods that are tied together, or the symbol of the power of the lower house of Congress, the mace of the House of Representatives, which is a fascia of rods that is topped with a silver ball with a bird on it, with an eagle. They're not thinking about that. No, they're thinking about the goose steppers in 1940s Germany, right? I get that. Okay. And the same when you're talking about economy, they're not thinking about, the Marxist concept of the proletariat who's working their butts off for the capital, the capitalists, that the value of their labor is being sucked up and enjoyed by those people up at the top while the others suffer, and that something needs to be done about it. I don't think that's what they're thinking about at all, because that actually sounds like a reasonable grievance. Sounds kind of familiar to me, but they're thinking about, Stalinist authoritarian governments that just, tell your people to toe the party line, or else, and all of your stuff is taken from you, and you're just basically a slave to the system. That's what they're thinking about. Okay. But when you characterize somebody like this just for having a different opinion, which usually doesn't mean that they share those attributes of those, you know, images that we hold in our mind, you immediately start to shut them off. You start to think about them as not one of you. It's a tribal thing. You're not quite human, whatever you are, because you're so different from me that I can't even begin to try to reason with you. I am unable to speak to you. And this comes forth sometimes in what I think is kind of a concerning way. I hear it a lot these past few years, where someone will say, "Oh, that's my father or my sibling or whatever, and I don't talk to them anymore. They voted for so and so. I don't talk to them anymore. They are out of my life." Which seems kind of extreme to me. Now, I'm not saying that you have to bond with all of your family members, and certainly there are reasons to exclude family members from your life. Trust me on that one. I know. But if they have an opinion about something that neither of you really have all that much power to control anyway, was what was the severity of that really warranted? I don't know. I mean, I guess it's up to you to decide. But I do feel like family, at least, have a shared interest. And a lot of times, family, like they say, they'll bicker amongst themselves, but when somebody attacks them from outside, they'll all band together. And I imagine that when you blow a tire on the side of the road, or your house gets burglarized and you need a place to stay, you're more likely to find, shelter or assistance from your uncle or whomever that you disagree with than you are some stranger that you have share the same political view with, right? Seems to me. Well, whatever. But um, this kind of demagoguery I noticed most recently in the events surrounding Alex Peretti. Okay. Now, here was the thing about that. Now, I do have a social media account on Reddit in particular, and I scroll through it and I get my brain poked just like everybody else. I'm falling into that trap just like everybody else. And I read memes and jokes and all that other stuff, video game stuff. But I do have politics threads. And part of that is I'm trying, and there are multiple of both sides. I hate to use that term, but it is what it is. Uh, so I can kind of understand what people on from a political spectrum are talking about, even though I don't agree with the language all the time or what their assessment is or whatever. I just want to understand what they're saying and why they're saying it, right? This group that I'm a part of generally leans left. Um, I joke that I'm the Ayn Rand of the group. That's not quite true, uh, not by a long shot, but because I hold, somewhat conservative views on certain things, it's kind of a joke that I'm kind of a little bit of an odd duck in this group. But that's okay, because they entertain the things that I say. I entertain the things they say. I have full respect for what they say. Oftentimes, they're very eloquent in defending their positions, and I get swayed a lot of the time, but at least very well understanding their point of view. And I've learned a lot in the last few years moving to the South and understanding the grievances of certain people, because there is some stuff going on that may not be obvious to others, and that's part of it is opening your mind to the experiences of others and trying to see it from where they're coming from, because they're living a life that's not yours, and your myopia, your solipsism, your social circle, whatever you want to say, may close you off from seeing that, and hearing their stories helps you have a better frame of mind in a greater context. And that's always been my thing, is to try to establish context, understand the larger picture a little bit, so that I can have a more refined and nuanced view about stuff. Okay. Alex Peretti, when that happened, my social media group started to post some talk about it, and I had very strong opinions about what had happened. Okay, now I had not read about it; I had just seen a few snippets about what had happened in the news. But what had happened is somebody, was talking about it to me, and I basically said, I don't know, I haven't looked into it, and even that response was kind of like, you don't have an opinion, and I'm not saying you're wrong. I just don't know enough. Okay, but it prompted me to look into it a little deeper. Okay. Now, when I first did this, I went to the front page of the internet, that google.com. I guess that's Reddit's title. It used to be, or whatever. I don't know. But go to Google, and I just asked a simple question: what is the deal with what's happening in Minnesota? And the first two articles that show up are have very slanted language in two very different directions. They're telling very different stories about the same stuff, same thing that happened. They're talking very differently about the two things that happened. One was a Fox News article that said something to the effect of, crazed domestic terrorist brandishing a weapon attacks federal agents and is shot and killed. And the other one, MSNBC or whatever it was, is, innocent protester is gunned down in the street by immigrations and customs enforcement officials. Okay. So right away, I know, oh man, I just want to know what's going on. Okay. I want to know the facts. I want to try to figure this out. So, of course, I have to go into this whole process of trying to sift through all this muck to try to determine some semblance of what I think happened in a somewhat reasonable fashion. Okay. Now, this is what I believe happened. Okay. There's some conjecture here, but after going through everything, this is what I believe happened. Okay. Alex Peretti was a member of an organization whose primary function, at least in this particular role, was to make themselves obnoxious and physically obstruct immigrations and customs enforcement officials from carrying out what they considered their lawful enforcement duties, because he's not an innocent protester, he's a conscientious objector, and he is trying to stop stuff from happening in a somewhat nonviolent way, in that he's trying to put himself in between these two, these enforcement officials trying to go after these people they're trying to arrest. Okay. Now, I believe Alex Peretti accepted the fact that there were probably going to be consequences to his behavior, because Martin Luther King also understood that there would probably be consequences to his behavior. That didn't make him wrong. Okay. He knew that the authorities would probably unleash dogs and fire hoses and all that other stuff, which they actually did. And he ended up spending time in jail and all those things. And of course, we know he got assassinated. But his actions probably would have warranted being arrested and maybe have to spend time in prison for obstruction of justice or whatever. I don't know. I'm not a judge, but I wouldn't be surprised if something like that happened. And I think he accepted that as part of the potential consequences of what was going to happen. Okay. Because he was trying to stop something that he felt morally obligated to try to stop. Okay. Whether you feel that's right or wrong, that's up to you. But that's what I think was going on with him. Okay. Now, while in the middle of doing this, he got into a scuffle with immigration officials. And based on their body language, again, this is an interpretation, I think what happened is they saw that he had a gun on his person and immediately saw him as a threat and shot him. Shot him once in the head while he was on his knees. And then multiple of these officers began to unload another 9 rounds into his body while he was lying on the ground. Which to me seems extremely excessive. Okay. And what started to happen afterwards, again, Department of Homeland Security sent a tweet out that said effectively the same thing that Fox News did. This guy is effectively a domestic terrorist. He was brandishing a weapon. He charged at officers, and he got shot and died. That's how they explained it. But of course, the video came out, and people started looking at it and like, that's not what happened at all. He did indeed have a gun on his person, but he wasn't brandishing it. He was holding a phone. So, because that story fell apart rather rapidly, they started to go after the fact that he had a gun. Oh, you have a gun at a protest, you kind of deserve it. Well, that created a cognitive dissonance, you might say, on their side of things, that you have a lot of Second Amendment people, very enthusiastic about that, that hold the belief that even if you're a political opponent in terms of ideology or whatever, you have a right to bear arms. And from what it looked like, he was open carrying. Okay. So, of course, it's, well, the gun permit? Yes, he actually had a gun permit. He had a concealed carry permit. So, not only did he have a constitutional right to bear arms, he'd gone through the process of being able to carry it in such a way that even if there was a question of whether it was concealed or not, he had the right to carry it. Okay. So then they started to say, well, he didn't have his ID with him. And first of all, I don't buy that very much. It's possible, but I know for myself, I never leave the house without my ID for the main reason that I drive my vehicle usually when I leave the house. But not only that, I need to present it for a variety of things, including going to the pharmacy, and if I get carded for something or whatever. Uh, Not that that happens all that often anymore. It's great getting older, but um, including if you get stopped and um, asked to present identification by law enforcement, right? Seems to me that a person who's acting with that level of coherence and cognitive ability is probably going to keep his ID on him, especially considering he knew what he was heading into. The last thing he wants to do is get arrested and have them do something funny with him by not him having any idea. That's that I could be wrong. I've forgotten my wallet from time to time, and boy, that sucks when that happens. I have to run home as fast as I can because I can't do anything, right? But regardless of that, they're starting to fish for reasons for this after the fact. They weren't asking him for his ID when they shot him. Okay? So then, in a similar fashion to the person they shot not a, less than a week before, who it kind of made a little sense, at least to me, because she was in a car and she floored it towards this guy, and he acted in a manner that basically, the way I read that, is this terrorist is trying to charge our base with a potentially explosive vehicle, and I've got to stop him from doing so. That's the body language I got out of that. Now that's reading a lot into the situation, but I also understand that a lot of these immigration's enforcement officers in this surge of hiring that they did, $100,000 plus a signing bonus and stuff, picked up a lot of war veterans, a lot of which are traumatized, and a lot of them have been trained not to be civilian law enforcement, but to be military combatants in a combat zone. And that looked like combat zone behavior to me. Now, I'm no expert. In fact, there's a person I should ask about that and what he thinks of it. But nevertheless, that was somewhat understandable. But I'll tell you what the first thing I knew about her is she had a wife. Why do I know this about her? It's a good question. I know exactly why I know this about her, because they're attacking her character. She's not like you. Is basically the message of that. I don't know Alex Peretti's marital status. They never said anything about that. But they were very interested in letting us know about this other woman's, I can't remember her name, her marital status. They were very concerned about letting us know about her marital status. But anyway, in a similar fashion, a picture started going around of Alex Peretti, and I don't know what the context is at all. It's him in a kind of a nurse outfit with colored dye in his beard and stuff, and it's kind of a goofy picture. But I don't know what it is. It could be a Halloween picture. It could be some party he was at. It could be who he feels that he is on the inside, and that's who he expresses himself as on the weekend or whatever. But that's irrelevant. That has nothing to do with anything. But that's also an attack on a character. He's not like you. So that didn't really stick very well because at least some people felt the same way I did. Why are we talking about this? That has nothing to do with him getting shot in the street. So finally, the last thing I've heard about it is there are other videos of him where he's like kicking in taillights and other stuff, other obnoxious acts of vandalism and whatnot or whatever. Okay. And while that is not behavior we want to endorse, I think, it still doesn't excuse what happened to him. When I finally boil it down, I have yet to see a viable reason why you would shoot a man in the head and then continue to shoot him 9 more times in the way that they did to him. Okay. And I would be a little more understanding perhaps if what happened was they saw that gun, because that's kind of how I read it. They saw that gun and freaked out and maybe shot him once or twice. And that would have been a horrible tragedy and absolutely ridiculous circumstance and all that other stuff. But at least I'd understand that it was a human reaction and something they did in the heat of the moment. But the way those officers acted in the immediate wake of gunning this man down certainly didn't look professional, boys. It was a bad look for immigration and customs enforcement. He's out of the news cycle now. They're not talking about him anymore. Poor guy. But there's kind of a silver lining to what happened to him is that stopped the conversation or the heat that was going up and started a conversation with the rest of the nation like, whoa, this is getting out of control. And I was actually concerned heading before that happened that things were getting really heated in Minnesota. And I thought that it was possible that the National Guard was going to stand off with immigration and we were going to have a civil war on our hands, or at least some sort of unrest or whatever that would invoke the Insurrection Act. I think that's the end game, honestly. It's a conspiracy theory, I suppose. But that's my opinion of what happened to him. I think what it is that these guys are not trained law enforcement, and a lot of them were trained as military in combat zones like Iraq, because it looked like something that you would see that got leaked out of Iraq. One of those awful things that we would do over there. Okay. And the problem there is that those guys, they see a gun in their immediate proximity to somebody that they're dealing with. They think enemy combatant. They don't think civilian with Second Amendment rights. They think enemy combatant and he needs to be dropped right now. Got him. And they act like it's a video game or something. And that's the larger issue, I think, is that we've got this authoritarian standing army operating in the United States doing this stuff. Now, if you back out, though, and you look at this issue, there are two sides, of course. And there's one side on the right that believes that illegal immigration is a real problem in this country. And I'm inclined to kind of agree with that, because when you got 20 or 30 million people who are here that do not have their proper paperwork and they're operating under the radar and in the strange tranche of the unbanked, where they're, using prepaid phones and prepaid Visa cards and all that stuff that they have to go through. Okay. They are marginalized by our society because they can't participate in the same way that a citizen can, or somebody who's naturalized, or even somebody on a legitimate work visa or whatever. They can't participate. And they also don't have an incentive to chase the people they're working for down about their rights, especially about like OSHA and stuff like that. And my belief is that the moneyed class prefers the status quo where we have this caste of cheap workers because it does a couple of things. One is it provides cheap labor and it also drives down prevailing wages. Okay. Now, that's not to say that these are bad people or anything like that, but the issue really comes down to the fact that you don't have your paperwork if you're having to exist outside the system. And I know for myself, when I spoke to the Canadian Border Patrol, when I got my Nexus card there, they were very clear to me that they would come after me if I overstayed my visa. you know, if you're working up here, we're going to kick you out. If you stay past your 6 months, we're going to kick you out. All that other stuff. And I wouldn't be, I honestly, I should not be surprised if Canadian federal enforcement came after me because I overstayed my visa and kicked my ass out. I don't think that that should be a shock to the system. And so a lot of people believe that this is a fairness issue. It's not a race issue, it's a fairness issue. And some of the most vocal proponents of this behavior are actually naturalized citizens because they believe that these people have jumped the line ahead of them. I spent 7 years trying to get my green card. Why do these guys get to jump the line? And there's also an argument about the tragedy of the commons and what they contribute to our tax base and what they consume and all that other stuff. And that's a statistics stuff that, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics, as Mark Twain said. I'm not educated enough on that subject, but it seems to me that, especially when you're talking about rents going up, if it's a supply and demand problem, that if you got people who aren't supposed to be here taking up residential space, that it is going to drive rents up. And, whether or not that's true, that is a belief that is being held by these folks on the right. But they don't necessarily hold it as a race issue. So if you call them fascist for that, holding that position, and you flip the bozo bit on it, not only do they feel like you're attacking them and claiming that they have a belief that they don't necessarily have, not to say that some don't, but that they don't necessarily have, they feel like I'm being unfairly attacked. Okay. And then, of course, on the left, they see it as a race issue. Now, of course, if you're immigrations and custom enforcement and your job is to get a quota of illegal immigrants and ship them off, you're going to go to Hispanic neighborhoods because, let's face it, the majority of illegal immigrants are Hispanic because they're coming from Mexico and other Central and South American countries, Latin American countries. So if you're looking for numbers, you're going to go after a Hispanic neighborhood. It's that simple. And it is a racial thing. It is profiling. Absolutely. I agree with you there. And not only that, the way they're carrying on, it brings basic, not even just constitutional rights, basic human rights and Geneva Convention rights. They're kicking in doors and grabbing people off the streets and taking them to God knows where. We don't know what's happening to a lot of these people. There's no transparency as to what's going on. And these guys are acting with such relative impunity and with such aggressive behavior. And on top of all this, the guy, after this shooting happened, and I can never pronounce his name, as Greg Bundino or something, the guy who's running immigration's enforcement, the guy on the ground, he can't not know how he looks. He's got this crew cut thing going on, and he's kind of gaunt as it is, and he's wearing this long green jacket, this overcoat with metal buttons and stuff. He looks like the Stasi at the very least, and quite reminiscent of other Germans from a little bit earlier period in the 1940s. It's not a good look to have this guy in charge of these people when they're clearly people, the grievance is that there's a racial element here. Okay. And on top of that, our Secretary of Defense, who they're trying to call the Secretary of War or whatever, his tattoos, while he doesn't have the obvious symbol that I was looking for when I first saw that, I have hung around, well, not really on purpose. I know enough skinheads from my original home world in Seattle to know what those symbols mean to those guys. Okay? Those jerks. So if you got a guy sporting that stuff as the person in charge of of your military, effectively, And you've got this other guy that's running around in this trench coat looking like somebody from the SS doing your brown shirt operation in ghetto neighborhoods. Boy, that feels familiar too. Shockingly so. People have a right to be concerned about this. It's out of control. So there are valid points on both sides. Absolutely, I believe that. And while I think that we should enforce the law, it should be handled in a much more professional manner than running around like soldiers on Call of Duty and gunning people down just because they happen to have a gun on them, which is their Second Amendment right. Alex Peretti did not deserve what happened to him, in my opinion. And heads need to roll, proverbially, for that activity. Okay? But in terms of labeling, there was an event that happened a number of years ago that is a little more sensitive because of who's talking about it. Okay. My ex is an author. Okay. And she was a member of the Romance Writers Association of America. Okay. Now, I'm not speaking for her. I want to be very clear about that. I'm only speaking for myself and my opinions of this thing that happened. Okay. Now, the Romance Writers Association has been around for a long time, and it was, I believe, it was founded, but definitely the powerhouse, not necessarily the leader, but definitely the face man of that operation was Nora Roberts. Now, you might recognize her name. Nora Roberts is a very prolific romance writer. Romance is one of the most popular genres in fiction writing. It is a moneymaker, and she was kind of spearheaded this organization as a way to encourage up and coming authors. She was really paying it back to the community, right? She's an incredibly successful author, and she wanted to spread the love in late in her career. So she put this organization together, and they had all sorts of meets and clubs and seminars and all this other stuff. And once a year, they gather in some conference or another, and they have an award ceremony. There are two kinds of awards. There were the Golden Hearts, which were up and coming unpublished authors. You couldn't be self-published either. That was a contentious issue, of course. What is self-published and all that. That was quite a conversation there. Um, and then the Rita Awards, which stood for I don't remember who she was, but I think she was a founding member or a famous author or whatever. But the Rita Awards were for published authors recognizing their work. Okay, and there were a bunch of different categories, kind of like the Oscars. It was a big deal to these people who are mostly ladies. Okay, mostly ladies writing this stuff, reading this stuff. It's a demographic. And my ex was nominated for one of these awards in 2013, I believe. Um, and she not only was she nominated, she won. It was such a great moment for her. She won this award. She was so happy. Won the a golden heart for paranormal romance. And um, it was such a beautiful thing to see these people who've been putting in so much effort to write, putting their heart out on a piece of paper and making this creative work, and have the committee of the Romance Writers Association, which included some very famous authors, to be recognized for their hard work and what they're accomplishing, and to encourage them. And of course, my ex, she showed up in this drop dead crazy dress. It was a good dress. She turned quite a few heads. That was pretty fun. I like that. But anyway, this organization was a yearly meet of just thousands of people who were just fans and people who were aspiring writers and all these other things. And some famous authors would be there and do signings, and they'd hand out free books. And it was a whole, like a con, like a convention. And things changed in 2017. Now, when I think about what changed in the political dialogue in general, was the election of 2017. because while social media was crazy heading into it, of course, there was all that misinformation. Some of it we're finding out is true now. I've always kind of suspected there was more fire under this smoke, but I'm a conspiracy theorist like that. Another label that we'd give to discredit people, which I had a video that talks about that, that conflates people who have outlandish tales, and some of this stuff feels very outlandish. It's hard to believe what we're seeing come out of those files. You got to face it down. This stuff is happening, okay? And I've known about this stuff for a while, but it's not something people would believe. They think you're crazy to believe this stuff because it's so outlandish. It can't be true. I assure you it is, man. It sucks, but you got to face it. But in those days, that stuff was crazy. But all that stuff was also going on with all this other stuff, and nobody knew what to believe and all these other things. And in that election happened, and it was a big shock to everyone. And what's interesting to me is that there was a silence almost throughout social media for almost 2 months until the inauguration. And when I think back on it, I think what was happening is the people who kind of drive the narratives in this country were trying to figure out what to do. They did not expect this to happen. This was not a planned event to have this man take office. Okay. And they had to figure out what they were going to do and what they were going to say, what they were going to try to get us to believe and all that other stuff. But in that meantime, it actually felt like a breath. It felt like we were just talking about fun stuff again for that brief, beautiful time before things got really nutty afterwards. Now, if you know anything about the primary process, as I intimately do from that time, the reason why that happened was twofold. Okay, one, while the Republican primary was filled with like 17 candidates or whatever, uh, the belligerent Donald Trump was in there making a bunch of racket and saying some crazy things. And the media ate it up. They loved it. They thought it was hilarious. Look at this guy. What a clown. You know, he's saying all sorts of wild stuff. He's this total edge case populist. Somebody like Ron Paul is kind of how they treated him, and thought, okay, well, he makes for good news and all these fun sound bites. Ha ha ha. But he's a lot smarter than people give credit for. Okay. And what it reminds me of is in Les Miserables, Victor Hugo talks about how Napoleon used cannon. You know, cannon in general in those days were used more or less to create attrition in the enemy ranks. You just lob a big old ball of iron into the bunch of men, and bunch would die or get hurt, and you would lower the enemy's numbers this way. But the way Napoleon used them is that he would actually focus his cannon not to take out as many men as possible, but to destroy individual chunks of the enemy line and cause disarray and make them run around and try to scramble and figure this out while they're in the middle of the field. And he ate them up. He was incredibly successful using this tactic. And that's kind of what Donald Trump was doing. He would find whoever was the front runner, who was his biggest political opponent, and he would go after them and make sure they got taken out. Make sure that all the talk was about what Donald Trump said about this guy, and would kind of go along with it, ha 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 ha, until their ratings fell through the floor because people bought into his dialogue about this stuff. So his first victim was Jeb Bush. Now, Jeb Bush, of course, was brother of George W. Bush and son, another one, of George Herbert Walker Bush. And he was kind of like, it's my turn. I can't wait to be nominated to be president. It's going to be awesome. You know, he was very overconfident, and he was not very eloquent, and he was riding on the popularity of both his old money family and the fact that two of his family members in recent living memory had been presidents themselves. So Donald Trump went after him first, and he took him out quick too. You know, look at this entitled brat. You know, look at him, low energy Jeb. You know, he doesn't even come to the floor. And Jeb was mopped up by Donald Trump, and his poll numbers fell through the floor, and he eventually withdrew. And this is what Donald Trump did to every single one of the front runner opponents in the Republican primary, and there were a lot of them. And he made quick work of them, one after the other, and the media was playing along with him. Ha ha, Lion Ted. Ha 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 ha. Right? Until suddenly they realized, uh-oh, This guy is top of the leaderboard now. And all that's left are people who aren't going to stand a chance against him. And they realized, as Michael Moore put it, he was a monster of their own making. Okay. Now, on the Democratic side, you had another interesting scenario. In 2008, Hillary Clinton, when she ran for office, when she started to run for the primary, and I was part of this as well, um, I was always a never Clinton man, not because of her immutable characteristics, but because she was a warmonger. You know, I didn't like the fact that she triangulated her opinion and all that other stuff. But the way it was shaping up in 2008 was she was in the front, and followed by John Edwards. And then with a respectable third was Barack Obama. Now, Barack Obama is the first person I ever donated money to in a political campaign before he was even nominated in the Democratic Party. It was called Obama for America. It was an exploratory committee. But I heard what he said, actually, strangely, about Israel, where he said one can be pro-Israel and not be pro-Likud, which is their right-wing, crazy Manifest Destiny party. And I thought that was such a nuanced statement. Now, of course, he had to walk that back. But just saying that, I thought was an awesome thing for a politician to say. That was kind of bold and actually was nuanced and interesting. A nice difference in how we tend to think about that country from our politicians. Okay. But anyway, the way it was shaping up is what people thought was going to happen was that um, Edwards was running behind, and so Hillary Clinton, to secure the nomination, would offer Obama the vice presidential spot in exchange for his delegates, and say, you know, I'll support you after our 8 years, and you'll be the next presidential nominee, right? But what happened in the middle of the primary process was John Edwards' campaign exploded because he was found out to have a love child with his maid or something. This whole scandal that came up, and he had to bow out of that nomination real fast. Well, a lot of the Edwards people were virulent anti-Clinton people, and so most of them went over to Obama, and suddenly Obama found himself in first place. Now, Clinton, of course, she comes up to him and she's like, don't get too big for your britches. Time to bow out and give it to me. But as Obama put it, he said, I'm Michael Jordan, baby. I'm going all the way. And he did. It was remarkable. Obama being nominated as the Democratic nominee in 2008. But at one point, Hillary Clinton, in the worst thing I've ever heard a politician say, and Richard Nixon took the cake, okay? So you have to go real far for me to think something you said is worse than anything that Richard Nixon said, okay? When Obama had cinched the nomination, from a numerical perspective, it was impossible for Clinton to get the delegates anymore. She was losing, and there was no reason to continue the Democratic primary. It was time to give up and accept loss and back the nominee. And she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't back down. And so the Democratic Party primary drug on and on. This went on for a while. Finally, the media asked her, why are you still in this race? Why don't you just concede now? You're starting to look like a sore loser. And her answer, remember what happened to Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was the Democratic frontrunner, and he was taking it away too in 1968. His brother was John F. Kennedy, who was a very famous president who was killed in his prime and all that other stuff. And Bobby Kennedy was against the war, and he was, pro civil rights and all that other stuff. The Democratic Party loved him. So, as is tradition in the 1960s, a man named Sirhan Sirhan just walked right up to him and shot him while he was giving a speech in a hotel. His security was totally asleep at the wheel. Maybe. Well, his death threw the Democratic Party in disarray. Who are we going to put in charge now? And through some political shenanigans, rather than allow the popular person, McCarthy, to take that nomination, who was anti-war and not very friendly to banks and stuff like that, McGovern changed rules of the Democratic primary process so that he would win. And people were pissed about it, boy. They were really unhappy about it. And in the wake of that, McGovern took the nomination, but a lot of Democrats stayed home. They weren't going to participate in this. They weren't going to back this guy. And so, because the Democrats messed with the primary in 1968, a Republican hardliner named Richard Nixon got elected because nobody wanted to vote for McGovern. So, of course, the McGovern Commission was convened afterwards. They put him in charge of the Democratic Party, whereupon they put in superdelegates to put the thumb on the scales of the primary process. Okay, that's how we ended up where we were in 2016. 2016, Hillary Clinton was the only nominee. She had left as Secretary of State, which is the concession that she got to finally bow out of the 2008 primary, that she would get Secretary of State for 4 years, and then after the next election, she would be in charge of the Democratic National Committee and be able to install all of her own people. Okay, that was what she got in exchange for finally knuckling under Obama. So, in 2016, there was no one that was willing to stand against her, because basically the message they got was, if you dare stand on that stage, you are not going to participate in any meaningful way, and you're probably going to be blacklisted from even eating lunch at McDonald's in Washington D.C. You know what I mean? But so the only person that stood up against her was Bernie Sanders. Now, if you understand what Bernie Sanders, what he always did was he always ran for president for every nomination, because what he was doing was he was using the podium as a platform to talk about his issues, right? Labor rights and lobbying and all those other things that we know about him now. But that was his whole shtick. And what would happen is he would be part of the debate process and get his few sound bites in, at which point the money would dry up. He would throw his hat behind whoever the nominee was, and rinse and repeat every 4 years or 8 years or whatever. Okay. So of course he did the same thing in 2016, thinking he was going to do the same thing, except there was only one person that was standing against him, was Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton was kind of a shoo-in. And even I was like, well, she's going to be the nominee, whatever. We'll see who the Republican nominee is. But Bernie Sanders started to gain steam because people didn't like Hillary Clinton. It's just a simple fact. She was a warmonger. She triangulated. She had a public and a private opinion. I want to know what your private opinion is, please. I don't want to have you tell me what I want to hear. I want to know what you think, And during her time as Secretary of State under Obama, she really lived out her time as a warmonger. She was constantly intervening in the Middle East, the Arab Spring and all that, Benghazi, the right-wing conspiracy. But so when Sanders started to actually get some steam, they started to mess with the primary process again, even though he was overcoming the superdelegate hump that had been put in by McGovern in 1968 because of them messing with the primary process that time. He was still so popular that he was getting past it. They weren't helping him either. I went to a rally for Bernie Sanders at Key Arena in Seattle, seats 20,000 people or whatever it was, and they only had 2 guards. He didn't have Secret Service detail, and they only had 2 guards at the door, and they were nice and slow about it too. So it took forever. I got in, but there were thousands of people standing outside that couldn't get in. They were so upset that they couldn't get in. I actually thought about opening that door at the arena to let all those people in, because it was on purpose, and I felt that way, because what the cameras showed was half-empty stands of this unpopular guy who's just talking, when really people really liked what he had to say. He was offering a different vision than what Hillary Clinton was proposing, a very populist vision that focused on the domestic issues in the United States rather than another warmonger. So they also messed with the election process, the democratic process, by changing floor votes. I was there when they were changing floor rules. While I was there without a floor vote, they were doing all sorts of stuff. They did shenanigans in Nevada to tilt the scales in her favor, all this other stuff. We saw what was going on. And when, of course, she got crowned by the Democratic Party as the nominee, a lot of us stayed home. I even told the canvassers, if you wanted us to go through all that, I wouldn't have gone through all that if I had known you were just going to put her in charge no matter what. Why just tell us and let us stay home and eat bonbons or whatever. So again, like what happened in 1968 and the shenanigans in 1972, which are also messing with the primary process. In this one, where they messed with the primary process, a Republican hardliner named Donald Trump got elected. It's what happens, Democrats, when you mess with the democratic process. 2020, they knew that this guy he had problems, man. It was very simple. Everybody knew this. We saw this on TV, those of us who finally got to see him not propped up or whatever his deal was through the 4 years of his administration, Biden. But we saw him in action and know that those guys knew that he wasn't capable. He was probably not running the show, maybe even from the beginning, because it wasn't like the primary process in 2020 was all that great, but in 2024, he could barely speak in front of a microphone. But the primary had already been secured. They already named him as the incumbent nominee and didn't give us an opportunity. And so they threw Kamala Harris in there. And Kamala Harris, while she was his vice presidential pick, she got destroyed in 2020 by one line from Tulsi Gabbard that basically all she did was call out her record as attorney general in California of basically treating prisoners like a source of free labor. The guys on marijuana charges and stuff. That's all she had to do. And that was it for Kamala Harris's campaign run in 2020. So we know also that Kamala Harris most likely would not have won the nomination on the merits because people didn't like her either. So, of course, they messed with the primary process. Disaffected Democrats stay home. A Republican hardliner named Donald Trump gets reelected. It's a long time since a president has served 2 terms non-consecutively. But in any event, we all learned from Donald Trump that you use rude language and you get things done, politically speaking. And so the belligerence started to show up in social media and the name calling and all this other stuff. And it immediately devolved into, if you hold a different opinion, you are the wrong sort of person. So we come back to the Romance Writers Association, okay, when everything was going haywire after 2017. And one of the board members was named, and I'm going to call her out. This is probably going to be contentious. Some people may not like me talking about this. This may lose me a few friends even, maybe. One of the board members was named Courtney Milan. This is her pseudonym, okay, the pen name that she writes under. And she was something of a social justice warrior. And this was the height of this stuff, okay? And she'd had a history of, I think she was a clerk for Sotomayor, and she also had a accusation. I don't know what the story was behind that. I'm not claiming one way or the other, but she had an accusation against another judge that she worked for of harassment. So she kind of came in as something of a champion of the cause, I guess you would say, of diversity and inclusion and all these other things. And she came in talking about how there isn't enough diversity on the board, there isn't enough diversity in the awards that are being won, all this other stuff. Now, when you talk about that stuff to people who are reasonable, who haven't really, they have a decent frame of mind, they'll hear you. They say, oh, maybe we do. Let's take a look. Let's talk about it. How are we selecting people with bias or whatever, right? They start asking to try to help, right? Maybe you're correct, and it's true. There was a lack of African American and other, non-white winners of these awards and stuff, but that wasn't really what it was about, in my opinion. Okay, because Courtney Milan, I did the math on it once. She had like 40,000 tweets over the course of some number of years, which I broke down. It was something like 7 or 8 every 7 or 8 minutes. She was constantly on Twitter, constantly on Twitter, talking. And what she had started to do is she would do this little fun exercise where she would find an author who was white, always white, and she would dig through their back catalog and look for something that was maybe insensitive or untoward or used whatever language. and she would put them on blast over it. She would find this snippet in a book and she'd paste it. And I'm thinking about one in particular. I don't remember her name exactly, but this is an example of how it would work. She grabbed this line from the book. It was written by a white author, and it was a story about a girl. I believe she was from Singapore or some Asian country, and she was like on a pirate ship or whatever. You know, it was romance novels, which are kind of they're already over the top. But this girl was Asian in the story, but the writer was white, and she took issue with that. And what she did was she found a line in the book where she used the term slow-eyed. She was describing the character's features. Slow, Sloei. I'm not sure what that refers to, but it's apparently a derogatory term, or they feel it's a derogatory term um, that they feel is insensitive, right? Or she felt it was insensitive at the very least. And she put that on there, and she was like, look at this, look at this, look at this horrible phrase that she uses in this book written in like 1988 or whatever, right? And all of her followers, she has a whole bunch of followers that are like, yeah, look at that. So the author engages, foolishly, we learn later. She's like, well, I wrote that back in 1988. Not an excuse. This shows your inherent bias. Well, I think she might have even said, I don't think it's that bad. Oh, no, right? Okay. But a whole bunch of stuff goes back and forth with her about this. And the author makes the foolish move to defend herself. But you don't understand that once you've been accused of this stuff, you cannot defend yourself. The only thing you can maybe hope to do is beg and hope that you are forgiven by the community for the dastardly crime that you committed. Please don't destroy me. But because she defended herself, all of her followers went after her agent, her book publisher. She might have even had a movie deal in the works or whatever, and tore that woman's career apart over this. And she would do this over and over and over again. The Salem witch trials in the 1600s went something like this, okay? At some point, somebody's cow had a two-headed calf, and the milk went sour, and the crops were bad. Somebody had a stillborn baby, that kind of thing. And finally, they were like, "There's a witch among us. There may be many." And they accused the person, "You're a witch." And this person would get, usually a woman, almost always a woman, would be accused of witchcraft, of consorting with the devil and getting special powers that negatively affected the community. And the questioning they would suffer would be nonsensical. How do you communicate to the devil? I don't know. But you do communicate to the devil, don't you? No. Oh, only a liar would say something like that, right? Just, there was no defending yourself. And so eventually what they would do is something like tie a bunch of rocks to you and throw you into a lake. Now, the human body is inclined to try to float and swim. But what they would say is if she floated, then that was evidence of her supernatural pact with the devil, and therefore she was a witch and had to be burned to death. And if she drowned, well, oops, my mistake. Murder, let's not talk about that after a false accusation, but her soul is with the Lord now because he knew she was innocent. And this behavior rapidly devolved into antisocial sociopathic behavior, which looks similar whenever this happens in a society, in even all mammal society. I'll do the sociopathic bears things one day, actually, because it happens there too in the animal kingdom. But what happens is twofold. One is the people who stand up for this person go, "This is a ridiculous accusation. Oh, you must be in league with her. You must also be a witch. Let's try you as well." So bad things happen to those people who stand up for just basic justice, due process or whatever. So you're naturally like, "Oh, I don't want to stand up for anybody who's accused of this. I want to stay nice and small." And I might even just join in the crowd and be like, "Yeah, that's a witch, because then I don't get looked at." And I might even do something as depraved as accusing someone else of being a witch, so that why would a witch accuse someone else of being a witch because, why would the devil want to reduce his number of his servants or whatever, right? There's no logic, so to speak. So you engage in this self-protective behavior so that you could keep the eyes off of you, but someone else would suffer for it. And then, of course, there was the truly evil behavior where people saw an opportunity. They wanted that stuff or whatever. There was just a rival, whatever the deal was. She's a witch. I'm pretty sure I saw her dancing out in the moonlight or whatever. And they would know what would happen, and they watched it with glee. And this carried on for weeks until some ecclesiastical minister came out from outside that society and crashed into their party like the soldier in Lord of the Flies. And it's like, whoa, whoa, what is happening here? Do you even see what you're doing to yourselves? This is a priest, I might add, who's supposed to be, supposedly a superstitious person. But he is seeing what this community is doing, is tearing themselves apart. And they all stop, just like Lord of the Rings, or Lord of the Flies, and had to snap back into reality. Okay. So another story I'll tell you, Jim Carrey. Okay. Jim Carrey was in the early 90s was on a show called In Living Color. Now, In Living Color was something of a riposte, you might say, to Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live famously would have an almost exclusively white cast with one, what they colloquially would call the token black guy. And that would be somebody like Eddie Murphy. And a lot of times when you look at the roles that Eddie Murphy would play on Saturday Night Live, you're kind of like, could you have selected somebody else for that one? You know what I mean? They're kind of putting him in the really not so great stuff sometimes. Okay. And In Living Color was trying to lampoon this by having a predominantly black cast, and they had the one token white guy, which was Jim Carrey. And Jim Carrey seemed to revel in this. He seemed to think like, I am the token, I'm the token white guy, and I'm going to be in the most awful and crazy roles and all that other stuff. But you can kind of see that he was a little bit progressive in that way. And however, at the same time, a movie that he made came out around the time In Living Color was on TV, called Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. Now, I rarely say this, but I would encourage anyone who's younger or who hasn't seen this to actually use a scholarly view when they review this movie. If you haven't watched it, it's a silly slapstick juvenile comedy movie, but it does not stand up well at all from the time that it was made. And what happens in the basic gist of the story is he's a detective that, investigates pet crimes or whatever. And the mascot of the Miami Dolphins goes missing. And so the mystery is to find what happened to the missing Miami Dolphin. Well, it turns out that the kicker of an old kicker for the Miami Dolphins, who for whatever reason felt like he was wronged for missing a kick and his career was ruined or whatever, was the culprit, and they had to track him down. Well, there's an authority figure, I believe it might even be his police captain or somebody, is this woman who's very aggressive, and she's an adversary of some sort in the movie. And at one point she kisses him very aggressively. She just grabs him and mashes lips with him, and he's confused by this because she's somebody hostile, but that was kind of hot, is basically how he processes that. Well, come to find out that she is this kicker who was a man back then and has transitioned into this woman. And there's this long drawn out scene where he is scraping his tongue and in a shower screaming and on the floor crying and all these other things from the horror of this violation that has happened to him that he didn't realize was a bad thing until he put that together. And it is hurtful when you watch it. You're like, oh my God, like she's a villain and whatever. She's the bad guy of the story, but this is not about that. This is about something else, does not stand up in our modern society at all. Now, I compare this a little bit to a movie that came out a little bit earlier. It was called Mannequin, but it was on TV all the time when I come home from school. And I've talked about to other people around my age about this movie, and then we all kind of feel the same way about this movie because we all saw it. It was on all the time. And the story was basically about this guy who was a night worker at a department store, and he would set up the windows out in the street. And he was kind of an art, configured himself an artist or whatever. And he's doing this job, and he opens a crate with a mannequin in it, and it's a girl that comes to life. This mannequin does, but only when he's by himself, when no other people are around, and she turns back into a mannequin as soon as the sun comes up or whatever. Okay, but it's kind of a fantasy story for a juvenile boy who's, wow, he's got a girl in a box and they go on adventures, and she likes him right away and all this other stuff, and she's kind of a damsel in distress and all this other stuff. But the sidekick of this movie is a character named Hollywood. Okay, now Hollywood is a pretty bad stereotype himself. Okay, he is a gay black man with the haircut and the polyester clothes and the flamboyant, all this stuff. But when I think about it, I kind of think that actually that is they're doing it on purpose. They're dialing him up to 11, so that there's no question in your mind what this man is. He is not generally accepted by society, both for his race, perhaps, and certainly for his sexual orientation. Okay, and the main character, when he first encounters him, because he's another night worker who does the same kind of work, he encounters this character, and he's a little put off. Not even put off. He's just kind of startled by his personality. He's very flamboyant, but he's friendly, and he's likable, and they quickly become good friends. And even though Hollywood understands that he doesn't swing this way, that's kind of the point. Is this guy is a friend. And I've talked to somebody before on this on social media. They said it was the first time I ever saw in media what he called a straight ally, because this guy just liked him for who he was, and he wasn't threatened by his sexuality at all, and he thought he was kind of fun to hang out with, and they were good buddies. They hung out, and Hollywood, for his own part, really liked this guy because this guy just accepted him for who he was. He didn't care. It didn't matter to him who he was, except for who he was as a person. So, of course, later on in the movie, Hollywood encounters our main character making out with a plastic mannequin. And Hollywood himself is presented with this shock, because this is not normal behavior. He himself is challenged by this, because now his own biases or whatever are threatened by this guy's weird thing that he's doing. Now, of course, the girl does not come to life in front of Hollywood. And the guy is saying, this is a real girl. This is a real girl. And Hollywood has to come to the decision, and you can see it play out. Does this really matter? Is this something that should break my friendship from this guy that is otherwise treating me awesome? This thing that doesn't really hurt anybody? Whatever. And he's like, you know what? I believe you. He doesn't believe him. But hey, whatever, man. I'm glad you're happy. And they continue to be friends. And then a little bit later in the movie, there's a point where there's a security guard that talks to the main character, and he says something like, hey, I see what you're up to, but I sometimes get a little frisky with the mannequins too, or whatever, right? And it's a different tone than the main character. So he's like, okay. But then he says, and I remember this line, it's too bad you have to work with the little Mary. And as a juvenile, straight, more or less identifying boy, the mannequin was Kim Cattrall. We were involved in this fantasy of running around with her in this store, but also this friend that's such a good friend. This guy is calling Hollywood names. He's attacking his character. He's being mean to him. We are appalled by this. And so is the main character. He's like, how dare you? How dare you talk to me that way? And so he embraces the rejection of normal society by being friends with Hollywood, by standing up for him. Okay. Now I think about that guy that I chatted with on social media, talked about his perspective on feeling seen by seeing Hollywood, because he already knew which way his his particular orientation went at that young age. And he felt seen by that, by the fact that there was a relationship, that you could be okay in society if you found people like this. But I imagine that same situation with somebody who didn't feel like they were born in the right body, would see what was happening in Ace Ventura, even if they saw Hollywood, and might feel partly seen because you can be different and still be liked by quote unquote normal people, and then see that, villain or no, that is no good. You got to keep hidden, because this is how society's going to view you. Okay. Now, I don't know if anybody's ever asked Jim Carrey about this, but I would imagine if you confronted him about it, he would probably say, "Yeah, that was not a good idea. That was not a good scene. I'm not real proud of that one." Right? Because who would be? And especially, I mean, if, even if he was cynical, it's probably something he would say because it's just not the right thing. Okay. So again, coming back to the Romance Writers Association, you had all these people that Courtney Milan was putting on blast one after the other and dragging out of the mud. And if you were silent on this subject, that was the other thing that was happening, is if you didn't stand for this, you stood against this. You didn't speak up. Why aren't you talking? Right? That was the kind of stuff that was going on. And people's careers were being ruined one after the other as this army of people on social media would turn their focus on these publishing houses and stuff, calling these people who I don't think most of them had, I don't think they had hate in their heart. They may have said something untoward and maybe didn't defend themselves right or whatever, but there was no winning. There was no winning. One after the other. And they started to pick up on this pattern of behavior. The board of the RWA did. Okay. And at one point, these awards, okay, you'd win this award and it was this accomplishment of such a magnitude, man. When you'd win one of these awards, you felt seen and acknowledged and all this other stuff. So the board, they would judge these stories, and I think it was normally 3 chapters. I think with the Ritas, they read the whole book, but for the Golden Hearts, it was like the first 3 chapters and a synopsis, something like that. Anyway, but they didn't necessarily have a picture of these people. I guess they could have derived something from their names or whatever, but I think they read the books and just judged how they felt. Okay. Was there a bias? Maybe. I don't know. But the thing is they announced the winner for this category, who was white. And Courtney Milan was like, nope, you got to give that award up. You have to give it back because this is not an acceptable set of winners, because it doesn't have acceptable amount of diversity according to her own rule set. And of course, the award winner's like, I don't want to give this up. Why are you ruining my moment? You know, I don't want to give away this Rita award. I worked so hard for it. Oh, you don't support the cause, eh? And so that woman ended up on blast as well. And so she gave up that award and she retreated. And I don't know what happened to her, but that beautiful moment, the moment that should have been beautiful for her, was destroyed, right? And the board had had enough, and they finally kicked her off the board. But then her army of followers made a whole big stink on social media, and under pressure, the board put her back. And then immediately, the rest of that board, half of that board, got kicked off. And at the end of the day, the RWA disbanded after a few years. It didn't stand up anymore. It couldn't. And Courtney Milan considered this a victory. She just kept presenting one head after the other, after the other, after the other. Look, I got another one. I got another one. I got another one. And finally, when the devastation of the RWA, the whole organization, fell apart, look, I tore down a racist institution. That's how she framed that. You won't see it that way on her Wikipedia page. I just looked at it not too long ago to refresh my memory about her. But as I mentioned, she was a clerk for someone who became a Supreme Court justice. She went to Berkeley. She spent a lot of time at school. Her name is Heidi Bond, and she led a fairly privileged upbringing. better than most of the people I believe that she was championing anyway. And at the end of the day, I don't think she did much good because that organization doesn't exist to give out awards to anyone anymore. And she saw it as a victory. I don't think there are many others, though, that would feel that way, except those that support her and that particular viewpoint. But this is the kind of thing that happens with demagoguery. Okay. I know what it sounds like because of my own immutable characteristics. Nevertheless, I don't think it was just what happened. And I imagine, because I've had this conversation with people, when I talk about what happened, oh, they don't like it when I talk like that about Courtney Milan because she's a hero in their eyes. But she's a villain in mine and quite a few others. So when we talk about other people and we think about what our own biases are and we can and we label them and consider them the other and that we are right and they are wrong somehow, that we're on the right side of history is a phrase I hear a lot of the time. You may be right, but are you being humane? Are you considering them as an inhuman enemy or a driver and a car that's getting in your way? Or are they actually a human being with thoughts and feelings and nuanced opinions that is not evil or stupid or both, as oftentimes people relegate them to be, and treating them as you would want to be treated? Because our immutable characteristics, none of us can help what we look like. We can't help our heritage or whatever. But we do know what injustice looks like, and it doesn't always cut the same way. So I'll conclude with this one. Somewhat after this event went down, or maybe even while I was in the middle of it, I'm not quite sure when that happened, but a movie came out by Disney Pixar called Zootopia. And I couldn't believe this thing made it past the censors considering what was going on at the time. Now, the story of Zootopia, again, a spoiler if you haven't seen this. Zootopia takes place in a utopian environment where the predator animals and the prey animals all coexist in this technological city that looks like kind of like a modern day. But they have a dark past. They have a dark history. Once upon a time, the predator animals were eating and being aggressive and all that other stuff to the prey animals. They were bad animals, so to speak, and the prey animals suffered for it. But at some point along in their history, way before any of these animals were born in the story, they had somehow come together and reconciled and become civilized. That was all in the past. But the wounds were still there, right? And people still remembered that once upon a time, this is what had happened. Now, on top, the person who was the mayor of the city, the animal is the mayor of the city, was a lion, the king of the jungle, a predator. And he seemed to be kind of a gruff, aggressive kind of creature, right? But he was in charge, and nothing seemed necessarily particularly untoward about him being in charge. He was just in charge of the city. But what started to happen was these predator animals started to go crazy and attack prey animals. And when they would be questioned, the predator animal who had done the crime couldn't remember what happened. They'd acted crazy. They didn't know. They couldn't explain their own behavior. Okay. And it turns out what's been happening is them being hypnotized by an electric device that is somehow activating some primal instinct in them to act in an animalistic fashion, hostile. Almost like he's having extreme information being delivered into his brain. Okay. So the mystery continues to unfold, and they start to suspect the lion, the king of this jungle, the old king of the jungle. And you know what? Predators, they still got it in them. They just can't get past themselves. That becomes the dialogue among the society, and the society begins to divide. And people who are good friends, who are both prey and predator animals, they start to divide up, and the predator animals are feeling hurt. They're like, I didn't do anything to you. Why are you calling me these names? Why are you thinking about this? I'm your friend, remember? But the division is happening, and the society is almost torn apart by this. Now, through continued investigation and adventure, our plucky hero and heroine, who happen to be a predator and a prey animal, um, they've come to find out that the lion is not responsible at all. He, in fact, is something of a victim here. And the person who's the perpetrator is his understudy, his associate, the sheep, the prey animal. And it turns out that she's been using this electronic device to stir up division among the people, because once the lion is out of power, she will rise on top and control this new society of prey animals where the predators are pushed down. It's going to be us now, a hero in her own mind. I couldn't believe what I was watching. I couldn't believe this story slipped past the censors during the height of all this stuff. But it was an incredible parable for what was happening at the time. And I definitely saw the parallels, for sure, from what I had been seeing happening in a community that was beautiful and almost utopian. These were gentle people, you know, introverted, somewhat older women most of the time. Some men. This was a big con. Everybody loved getting together and reading books and talking about their work, and they would share their experiences and learn from each other. And overall, the mission that Nora Roberts, before she split, just before this stuff started to go down, she started to read the writing on the wall. They would all lift each other up. It was meant to lift up the romance genre at large and to make it relevant. And to some extent, that organization did. Romance became a legitimate force in fiction, and in no small part to the Romance Writers Association that Nora Roberts was in charge of. And now it's all gone. And while the cause may have sounded just, and it seemed like the right thing to talk about these things, the society was not prepared to deal with someone like Courtney Milan, and she destroyed it all. And I feel like it's a warning to not just consider your own biases and think about those kinds of things, but also watch out for people who are doing stuff like that. The sheep that are looking to have a new position of power and to lord over their new ruined society. Because they don't do anybody any good.